And then we're going to go ahead and jump into what is the counselor educator's role in teaching telemental health counseling. So what does KCREP have to say about it? How do we collaborate with our licensure boards in our local states, that sort of thing. And then also, what would be your role as a supervisor? And as I was kind of putting this presentation together, I was feeling kind of an interesting, it's not really a parallel process, but it's interesting how we could have two roles as supervisors. So we could be supervising individuals who are providing telemental health counseling, but we also could be using telecounseling as our method of providing supervision. So like that idea of like telesupervision. So not really an inception of supervision on top of supervision, but really kind of like a dual role, or two ways that we can look at that, and we will do so. And then I'm not going to leave time at the end for question and answers, but feel free to jump in if you have questions, even if you just have comments. I would love to read aloud some comments, and we can have a little bit of a discussion. There's 22 of us on here right now, so I think that that's totally doable. So just to start off by defining telemental health counseling, it's when the provider, the counselor, is in one place, the client is in a separate place, a separate location, and we administer our healthcare, our professional counseling through technology. There's lots of different types of technology that we can use, and so we've got various different video conferencing platforms right now. You can use Zoom, you can use WebEx, you can use all different types of platforms that are out there. Doxy.me is another one. So you've got different types of methods of delivery. You also can do written chat. And so sometimes we don't have the opportunity or the availability for video, especially if like internet is low bandwidth and that sort of thing. So we could do written, typed counseling. And then you also could do audio only, which to me kind of sounds like phone calls, right? So there's lots of different ways that we can do it. And I think it's important to note, this kind of spoils one of my next slides, but it's important to note that all of those things do constitute telemental health counseling, right? So just because we're only typing, just because we're only using email, just because we're only on the phone, that does not mean that it's not telemental health counseling. So all of the ethics and rules certainly apply anytime that we're administering therapy using technology. Other names that we should be aware of: telebehavioral health, distance counseling, online therapy, cyber counseling, all of those things. I'm using the term telemental health counseling. It aligns with that certification that Dr. Kress mentioned earlier from the National Board for Certified Counselors, which I'll talk about momentarily here. So here's my 2 truths and a lie slide. And like I said, I kind of spoiled the the anticipation here. So what does count as telemental health counseling? Scheduling appointments online. So one of these does not, and the other 2 do. Sending worksheets via email, and a counseling session over the phone. I already answered that one, that for sure a counseling session over the phone is telemental health counseling. Additionally, sending worksheets over email is telemental health counseling, right? Because we're administering therapy, we're not just doing scheduling. So that's the answer there, is that scheduling, that's not considered telemental health therapy. But anytime that you go from we're meeting on Monday at 2 to how's your week been, then that constitutes therapy, right? So I hope that's like a pretty clear-cut difference. If it's anything beyond dates and times and places, if it has anything to do with the individual's experience of the world around them, then we have transitioned into therapy, telemental health counseling. So I am a board certified telemental health provider, and that's why I use the term telemental health counseling. What it is really important to say here is that when you're offering telemental health counseling, you are operating under your state license. So whatever license allows you to provide counseling services to the public, that is the license that you are using, and that license is not only necessary, but it is also sufficient. So whatever, our licensure goes state by state, and I do have a fun link that allows us to look into our specific state's rules around telemental health counseling that'll be provided later on. But I think it's very important to note that that state license is what we're operating under when we're providing telemental health counseling. And so it's really important to check back with our state board. And again, you can't offer telemental health counseling services without an active and relevant state license. So this credential certification offered by NBCC is very important, because what it does is it demonstrates that I am up to date on my education. And that's going to be one of those requirements. Best practice of providing telemental health counseling is that I am up to date and well trained in the area. So my BCTMH just kind of, I don't have to say I've been doing this since 2018 and I've done this many presentations or I've done this research. All I have to say is I'm a BCTMH, and that tells you I've done my 9 hours of core training. I maintain 4 hours of continuing ed every single year. And so just by saying BCTMH, you kind of know where I stand in terms of my my knowledge and staying relevant. That's the major benefit to your BCTMH, is that it establishes that you are qualified, because again, your license is what's required in order to offer the services, but your license does not necessarily require that you are educated and well trained on telemental health provisions. Here's the two primary resources that we as mental health counseling professionals and just professional counselors in general will kind of tend to go back to. The ACA Code of Ethics, there's a whole section on distance counseling, and then also the National Board for Certified Counselors provision of distance professional services policy. So those two links, I think every person who administers telemental health counseling should keep on hand. And again, if we go by the most stringent definition of telemental health counseling, we are offering those services when we email a worksheet to a client, right? Or check up on them and do like a midweek check-in if somebody has been, having an especially rough time. So I think that really the majority of our students and our supervisees should have these policies on hand for the ACA Code of Ethics. We always should have on hand, but specifically Section H and also this distance professional services policy. We should encourage and perhaps even just verify that our students and our supervisees have this accessible and readily on hand at all times. So the National Board for Certified Counselors, within that distance policy, says that telemental health counseling does present unique concerns. Technology continues to advance, and we have to adhere to all policies and procedures, including our Code of Ethics. The ACA Code of Ethics says that we have to actively attempt to understand the way that the world is evolving around us. And we also have an ethical imperative to provide services that have a reasonable promise of being effective with our clients. And also within this Code of Ethics is mandated that we should be up to date on how telemental health counseling can be used to better our services. And so it's definitely something that's optional, but at the same time, I really do think that it's the way of the future. It's not going anywhere, and we definitely need to uphold our ethical responsibility to be aware of the presence of technology within the work we do as professional counselors. Even when counseling began, there was telephones, and we used telephones I take that back. When counseling first began in the 30s, there probably was not telephones readily available yet. But very far back in the history of counseling, we used, technology to schedule our clients. And I imagine that sometimes therapy did happen over the telephone. I can't come today, but let me, can we take 15 minutes just to do a brief check-in over the phone, right? So that was probably happening as early as the 50s, the 60s. And so we need to remember that counseling has always included a little bit of a technology piece. And as the world evolves, it's important for us to stay on top of that as educators, as supervisors who are serving as gatekeepers to the profession, and also role models to our students and our supervisees of what they can and cannot do, what they should and should not do as professional counselors. So some of the benefits of telemental health counseling, just briefly, is, the accessibility piece, which is that's also a limitation, because some individuals do not have the accessibility needed in order to enjoy telemental health counseling services in a private and safe location. So that's not always an advantage, but it can certainly be an advantage for those individuals who happen to have that type of setup, and the privilege that goes along with having a private office, a quiet space, a safe home, an internet connection, the technology, the materials that you need to engage in telemental health counseling. So, but overall, accessibility is technically a benefit. As a licensed professional in North Carolina, I am able to serve any individual within the state of North Carolina. And so that it really increases clients' accessibility to high quality services. There's also flexibility in scheduling, so I don't have to drive anywhere. Evenings are maybe not as difficult because I can come home from work, make dinner, and still see a client, right? And so it just increases that flexibility and balance. There's also some benefit to seeing clients in their natural surroundings, which is also kind of a limitation in itself, because we have to remember that it's hard. It creates a little bit more challenge to enforce boundaries. And so we'll talk about that in a little bit. Overall, the effectiveness is still being researched, but it seems as though there's pretty good numbers and research to support the fact that telemental health counseling is as effective as in-person services, depending on what is the client's presenting concern, their suitability for telemental health counseling services, and certainly the effectiveness of telemental health counseling continues to be studied, and we need additional information about the broad range of concerns, the limitations, maybe areas where telemental health counseling is not as effective. But overall, at this point, we can use our clinical judgment to determine what clients are most appropriate for telemental health counseling. And then that it seems to be pretty effective when we do a good job of matching a client's need to the modality that we're using. So risks, again, are determining client suitability, and it is our responsibility, according to ACA, to determine if a client is able to engage and to get what they need out of telemental health counseling. And so, so again, there's not really any concrete right now saying like, well, you can't work with individuals who have schizophrenia. There isn't a lot of that research out there, because sometimes as I say that, I'm like, I know that some of my clients with schizophrenia probably would much prefer the safety, the comfort, the predictability of being able to remain within the home. And it would make a big difference whether they were in an actively psychotic phase versus if they had been in remission for a year or two, right? So we just have to use our clinical intuition, our clinical knowledge, our clinical judgment, and we need to really foster that in our students and our supervisees, that critical thinking piece of knowing what we know about the limitations of this platform. Do you think that this is a viable candidate for telemental health counseling? Why or why not? And then we're also going to go back to that accessibility piece, is sometimes it's maybe not the best fit, but it's a better fit than nothing, in terms of if an individual cannot have access to other in-person services and that sort of thing. So we always have to weigh all of those different factors. There does tend to be an increased risk of confidentiality. So as I mentioned before, you're operating not out of an office where everything is pretty much standard structured. Everybody there is there to do their jobs. Clients are in their homes and there's people in their homes with them. We're in our homes and there's potentially people in our homes with us. And then we've moved away now, since as we close that gap of distance, we use technology in order to, maintain client records, to transmit information back and forth. And so there does tend to be a little bit of an increased risk to confidentiality. But on the flip side, individuals don't have to come to a designated mental health facility. And so there's increased confidentiality in the fact that I can receive mental health counseling services from the privacy of my own home, and nobody nobody needs to know that or will know that or will see me accessing services. So it seems as though as we go down, a lot of things in counseling, there's pros and cons to everything. There's really not a whole lot of clear cut right or wrong answers. And so one thing that we're going to want to do with our students and with our supervisees is help them to become quite comfortable in the gray area and to just validate that that consultation is probably one of the biggest keys in any sort of a situation where there is not a clear cut right or wrong answer. All right. So ACA also in that helpful section H explains to us that when we're offering telemental health counseling services, we are subject to the laws and regulations of both the counselor's practicing location and the client's place of residence. So they say that we understand that we might be. And what we need to do is look at every state's individual laws. Now, when I talk about these things, it's in absence of any sort of COVID-19 adjustments or leniencies that have been created. So I prefer just to kind of stick by the book, and that way we don't have to be constantly checking and updating. And also, this is, like I said, technology was here before COVID and it's going to be here after. And so I think that it's important just to kind of remain steadfast and have long-term predictability. So what you need to do is look at your state's law to kind of see what they say about where counseling occurs, right? So counseling, oftentimes the board will indicate that counseling occurs where the client is located and where the counselor is located. There are some states where that wording could be different. It might say something like counseling occurs where the services are provided, but that's like a difficulty. It's like a gray area in terms of our telemental health counseling. Is like, does that mean I'm providing the service, so it's located here in North Carolina, or that the client receiving the services is where it takes place? So again, we have to dig into our state rules and laws, and then we have to make interpretations that would be readily accepted by the majority of our professional peers, right? So that goes back to the consultation piece, and of course checking with your board as well. But for the most part, what I suggest is that you only provide services to residents of the state where you're licensed, and that you provide services in that state as well. So just to kind of keep things as clean as possible, you're licensed in North Carolina, you provide services to residents of North Carolina. There's some interesting caveats to that, and especially as I'm teaching students or new supervisees, I'm definitely going to stick with that, right? You're licensed in the state, you practice within that state, and practice includes both where you're located and where your client is located. With COVID, there was a little bit of leniency there. It can get very tricky if you have a client, say, go off to college temporarily. Those are things that you would have to explore on a case-by-case basis. But I would say when teaching our students, when teaching our supervisees, we say you practice in the state where you're licensed. Okay. So what is the role of an educator in terms of this idea of telemental health counseling? Well, obviously, we are going to teach our students. That's what we do as educators. And I think that it is important for us to teach our students about telemental health counseling. It's definitely, like I said, it's not going anywhere. It's part of the ACA Code of Ethics that we look at the most effective and helpful services for our clients. It is more so now than ever, partially thanks to COVID, it is widely accepted as an effective way to provide mental health services. And so I do think that every educator should include some sort of training and priming to our students that, telemental health counseling it's a real part of our profession. So I feel like it is doing slight disservice to our students if we're not teaching it at all, if we're not bringing it up at all. But I will have to say for myself, COVID was the impetus for us to start including that in our coursework and in our field placement specifically. So I wouldn't judge you harshly at all if it's really not a part of your curriculum, but it's certainly something to consider. And I will share the training resources that we created at UNC Pembroke that are free, accessible to everybody. The only downfall is they are North Carolina specific, but that's, you know, a pretty small portion of the overall training, and you could just kind of adjust for your specific state's laws and rules. So we, as educators, if we decide and agree that telemental health counseling is important, then our role would be to teach our students how to use it effectively and ethically. Another thing is that we need to ensure that if our students are using telemental health counseling services on site, and again, you know, when you start to broaden that definition to sharing a worksheet via email counts as telemental health counseling, then it really does kind of start to put a fire under us of like, we really need to be making sure that our students are doing telemental health the right way and have learned about this and gotten at least some training on this, because more than likely it's happening on site for our students, whether we are formally allowing it and they're doing this type of, you know, video conferencing over DoxyMe 1-hour sessions via telehealth, or whether it is kind of, I did a weekly check-in, I called my client to make sure that they, you know, hadn't gotten worse, or I forgot to assess for suicide, so I called and assessed for suicide, right? Those things start to fall under the provision of telemental health counseling services. KCREP does not prohibit against telemental health or distance supervision for meeting educational needs. And that includes our students on site for practicum and internship. There is no set cap on how much telemental health counseling services our practicum students, our internship students are allowed to offer. So that's really an interesting concept. And this is not in relation to COVID relief or anything like that. This is actually at a website for KCREP that's called like COVID relief is expiring, but here's where we stand on this issue regardless of COVID. So we could technically have students doing fully distance counseling services as their field placements, which is both exciting and also a little bit concerning, right? It means that we have an ethical responsibility as educators to make sure that they're trained up the way that they need to be. And we are able to provide this training underneath the respective state licensing boards. So again, remembering that if your state prohibits it, then that would precede KCREP, right? So KCREP says we don't say you have to or that you may not, right? And who would actually ultimately have the power to say that is your state licensing board, because our interns, our supervisees are typically able to do what their supervisor and what is able to do, right? So it would go by the licensure held by the supervisors in the situation, which would be, you know, also you as a licensed educator as well. So again, states have specific rules. In general, students do what their supervisors do. And so that's not necessarily in the context of supervision. It's like, you know, what you do, how the way that you practice and offer your professional counseling services is the way that a student can offer their professional counseling services. One thing to consider also is the liability insurance. So when COVID came, you know, I really was, I was struck by the way that that COVID really just brought this to the forefront, and at the same time, it was really like a swift kick for us to really kind of dig into these things. And I was struck by the idea that I should have been doing it sooner. I don't know how much sooner, but probably you know, from the start of my career, this is something I should have been looking into. So what we need to do is check the liability insurance that our students carry and make sure that they are covered. We need to do the same thing for ourselves as well, as practicing clinicians. But our students, our supervisees, we need to ensure that they do have professional liability insurance. I know most universities require it. So the university has an insurance policy, the site the field placement site might have an insurance policy, but every student needs to carry their own. And typically the way our students get it is through membership in one of the professional organizations, and they pay their student membership fee, and it also includes liability insurance, a personal policy. And so I went through and verified the insurance policies that are provided through student membership in ACA, American Mental Health Counseling Association, LPCANC, which again is North Carolina specific OMCA branch of in North Carolina, and then also the American School Counseling Association. So those insurance carriers, it's typically HPSO or whoever they contract to provide the insurance, they say that it's fine. The students providing the services must adhere to the same practice standards that they would in-person treatment and care. And interestingly, that's the stance of the North Carolina board, is that they do not view in-person services different than telemental health counseling services in general. Right. So everything that applies online. Everything that you can do online. You would want to practice in accordance of the standard of care. And so I would say, as educators, as supervisors, we would also want to confirm with our insurance companies that there's nothing special or different in their eyes or their view. But in general, I haven't found insurance that says you can practice in person, but you can't practice online, because again, it's much more woven into our professional practice than I think most of us realize until we sit back and start thinking about it. All right, so then I had already started to talk about supervisors, and we've got this idea that supervisors might be overseeing field placement students or new professionals who are providing telemental health counseling services. And as a supervisor, it's our jobs to make sure that they are providing those services ethically within the legal limits. And I'll give some pointers as much time as I have to give like some of the very specifics of the legal requirements, HIPAA, and that sort of thing. But again, I'm going to give you a link to an 8-hour training and resources as well that you can pull and look at, because it can be overwhelming. So really, I guess my main purpose is to kind of highlight what does count, what does not count, and the fact that we all really should be digging in and thinking about our services in terms of technology that is such an ever-present and important part of our daily lives. And then if we're not, as supervisors, overseeing individuals who are new to the field and providing distance counseling services, we might also, as supervisors, be providing telesupervision, right? So the definition of distance counseling would apply to telesupervision as well. So the supervisor's in one place, the counselor trainee or the new counselor is in a different place, and provision of services is provided via technology. And so we also then have to go back to our state laws and say, does this count? Is this allowed? Right? So most students have a requirement of a certain amount of individual supervision hours within the first few years of practice. And if we're meeting not in person, but if we're meeting face to face via technology, does that count? And as a supervisor, we have to sign off on our reports, our quarterly reports, that yes, I've been providing this face-to-face supervision with my student or my supervisee. And so again, I hate to be a broken record and say you need to consult your specific state's laws, but that is certainly the truth. And that website that I provided is really helpful. When you click it, you scroll down, it lists all 50 states. It brings you to information about their distance counseling and distance services policies. So, some of the benefits of telesupervision really align with mental health distance counseling services. So you get to use current technology, you have increased access to quality supervision, which can increase diversity, increase flexibility. The effectiveness is still in research. And one thing that I noticed is that oftentimes we don't have a lot of studies out there that actually test the effectiveness of supervision. So so this study, Inman et al. 2019, they had individuals who were getting distance supervision report whether they thought that it was effective, whether they stayed on task, whether they felt like it was a good fit for them. But there wasn't that second step that would say, like, pre-test, post-test, how are your clients' outcomes currently? And then after distance counseling supervision, how are your client outcomes now? Right there, that is kind of a very complex model to study supervision. And so that is probably where things need to go in terms of telesupervision, is maybe like this group of new counselor had this baseline effectiveness, maybe on the outcome rating scale or something like that, and they received in-person supervision. This group had a similar baseline and they received telesupervision, and this is how their clients actually their client outcomes came about. But again, you can think of a million reasons why that's impractical and difficult, and we can't really say that the supervision did or did not work. So supervision research is a very complex animal in itself, but we do need additional research on how telesupervision, is it effective? Is it the same quality as in person? The same challenges apply, maybe scheduling, technology issues, difficulty seeing nonverbals of the client or of the supervisee. And then also we have to think about supervisee attitude towards supervision, which is something that's very important regardless. And also we need to adjust our approach. So if we have a supervisee who's open to supervision, but maybe not open to supervision via technology, we really have to keep that in mind and consider that. If we have a supervisee who's generally not open to supervision, then it might not be the best to do telesupervision, just because the individual is maybe not engaged to start with. And so having this distance might not help support that process. But at the same time, it could help support the process. It feels less invasive, it feels less cumbersome. And so really, again, it's a case-by-case basis of whether you think that telesupervision is appropriate for your supervisee. And then also we need to be really mindful with the nonverbal communication barriers, what approach that we take, and we need to be very intentional that we are following a supervision approach that is kind of proven, tested and true, and that we are intentionally modifying it for the online platform. And I will talk about that when we get down to the end, talking about supervision models, right? So we've got developmental models of supervision, and again, there's a lot of room for research. You could write a conceptual piece about how to apply the discrimination model of supervision using telesupervision, and what adjustments would you need to be mindful of and think about. It's just a kind of a never-ending type of considerations that you need to make to kind of adjust from in-person to online. But one of the key things is those nonverbals and really attending to the relationship, which you can certainly do via technology, right? You are mindful of your eye contact. You can still use proximity because it's very obvious when I'm, further away, or when I'm leaned in and interested and attending to you. And so those same concepts that apply in person, we just have to mindfully apply via distance. So when preparing for telesupervision, we would want to, again, verify our jurisdiction and the state laws and rules around providing distance supervision. We ourselves would want to determine scope of practice. So that might be, maybe we don't do distance supervision with students, but we'll do it with new professionals. Maybe we don't do it with new professionals who have a high risk caseload, but we'll do it with new professionals who have a relatively lower risk caseload. That's really up to us as supervisors to determine our scope of practice. It's important to start off by setting very clear expectations with our supervisees, which I think that's relevant in person and online, but those expectations are going to also include, when you're on, WebEx with me or Doxy or whatever it is that we're using, I expect you to be paying attention, not scrolling Facebook, actively engaged, camera on, make sure that your microphone works properly, so setting those types of expectations. And you can practice the technology with your supervisee, and especially if they're providing telemental health counseling services, then that really is a parallel process, right? Me as a supervisor practicing the technology with my supervisee models them practicing their technology with their clients as well. The same requirements for confidentiality that you would have for providing telemental health counseling services would apply for our supervision services. And as with any type of counseling or supervision we do, you should always come prepared. So here's a few, like 3 of the most common models of supervision. And again, I kind of jumped ahead to say what a wonderful piece that would be, a conceptual piece on how to adjust the discrimination model for telesupervision, right? And so that is a pretty unending type of opportunity that we would have as researchers and educators, is to kind of start picking apart how would we adjust all of these kind of really well-established supervision models so that they translate to a distance platform. That's something that we definitely can continue, but again, case by case basis, just keeping in mind that what we do in person is going to look largely the same, but we might have to attend to the fact that we just don't have that physical connection with the individual. And so our body language might need to be more exaggerated. We might need to pay more attention to the body language that we're able to observe. And then otherwise, just, how would these types of things translate using technology? That's a really good question. I believe that Laura can answer that question. If these slides are going to be available for download or emailed to you, I'm definitely happy to share the slides. However it would be, I'll give those to Laura and she will figure out how to get them to you all as well. Okay, so we have to be a little bit creative when counseling from a distance. And also it is recommended that you might consider supplementing with face-to-face supervision as well. And that actually, in that self-report study, that was kind of highly valued by supervisees, is just every once in a while checking in person. All right, so when we're teaching our supervisees or our students to use telemental health counseling, these are the things that we need to really pay attention to. And I've got a slide for each of them. But we need to, first and foremost, just always remember that we have to limit the sharing and the storage of protected health information to what is therapeutically necessary. And we need to teach our students what is the difference between kind of that art of writing a case note, what should be included in the case note and what does not need to be included. So we must document this. It is important to document that we assessed for suicide, but I don't need to say exactly who the client was sleeping with last Thursday, right? So kind of helping our students learn the difference between those two. The same thing goes for protected health information. So protected health information is anything identifiable of the client. So birthday, the individual's address, phone number, things, email address, name, of course, those are all protected health information, diagnosis. And so we want to remind our supervisees, ourselves, our students, to limit documentation of that health information to what is therapeutically necessary at all times. End-to-end 256-bit encryption is a very complex term that is the standard of HIPAA requirements. So basically, when information such as birthdays, and I realize I should probably list out a list of what is PHI, right? So I think I went over enough of them to give you a general idea, but I'm sure there's an exhaustive list of what is considered protected health information. But all of our client information, when it is at rest, so when it is in storage, think about when it's on a piece of paper, locked up in a cabinet, right? But via technology, it's going to be on a file sitting on some sort of a device, right? When it is at resting state, it should be encrypted, which means that it's scrambled, essentially, is what encryption means. And typically what you can do is whatever platform you're using, whatever devices you're using, you can look specifically for that specific platform device to ensure that that is occurring. And a key term that we need to know is a business associate agreement, a BAA. And that the purpose of that is it basically says our platform is HIPAA compliant, which implies that it's got this 256-bit encryption. So like doxy.me, doxy.me is a free video conferencing service that you can use, and it comes with that business associate agreement. And so you know that it is following HIPAA. Kind of related is that like the free version of Zoom, the free version of WebEx, not HIPAA compliant. The paid version is HIPAA / FERPA compliant. So FERPA is with our educational records. And if we are adhering to HIPAA, we are going to be upholding FERPA as well. We've got, you have to think about what device you're using, the platform that you're using, like I said, to kind of actually do the actual communication. There's information about your cellular service, and I'll just kind of allude to the fact that there's this conduit exception. So the conduit, the way that the information is transported from one resting spot to the next resting spot, that is exempt, which includes our cell service and our internet service. So that is inherently encrypted and safe for everyone. Caveats to that, if you have a landline, that is within HIPAA compliance. If you have a digital landline, and we often don't know the difference, you have to ask your provider, the digital landline is not necessarily HIPAA compliant. So that's one thing, but any cellular service, any phone call that you make is inherently compliant with HIPAA. Again, internet service as well. And the caveat to that is your Wi-Fi, right? So the internet service comes through a cord. I think we probably all remember that when internet first started, right? You had to have that cord that you would plug into your computer. Well, now that cord still exists, but what we do for Wi-Fi is we plug that cord into a router, and then the router beams it out. And even me saying it, that indicates right there, we don't want our PHI beamed out to everyone. So it's really important that our router is password protected, right? So when you go to join a Wi-Fi, there's like a little lock next to it, and you have to enter a password. That means that it's protected. Those open networks we don't want to use for any sort of mental health or distance supervision services. We also have to think about where and how will we store our files, and how will we accept payment as well in accordance with HIPAA. So that's like the main list of things that you as a supervisor or an educator need to know that your students and your supervisees know and understand and are complying with, right? So with a computer, if at all possible, use a computer that's dedicated to yourself and to the work that you do as a professional counselor. It should be password protective, and your hard drive should be encrypted if you are storing things directly on your hard drive. However, I don't do that. I store things in a cloud-based service called Simple Practice that comes with the business associate agreement. So I kind of bypass the need to encrypt my hard drive. But if you prefer to have your files at rest on your computer rather than in an encrypted cloud, then you are going to need to encrypt your hard drive. And I mean, not to be very simplistic about it, but you definitely could Google, how do I encrypt my hard drive, right? And kind of go from there. So I think a lot of the difficulty with technology is that it does kind of fall into our hands specifically, and we have to reach out to resources. I'm sure somebody at Best Buy could help you with that if you really needed to. And so oftentimes, though, we are fortunate enough to have access to technology people through campus if you're an educator. And so or even at your place of business if you are a supervisor. excuse me. And then the next thing is that our cell phones or our tablets, they are okay to use for therapy, but we need to have them encrypted. So Apple products kind of pride themselves on being encrypted. If you've got an Android product, you need to have it encrypted. And oh, that's a good question. So and you would want to make sure that you encrypt any sort of like an Android tablet or cell phone. And you also want to make sure that you enable the 6-digit password, the hard one, on your smartphone or your tablet, whether it's Apple or Droid. So it's standard, the 4, and I know it was heartbreaking to me to have to go from the 4 to the 6, but it's important. So do that. That is the HIPAA standard. The question that came through is, would I suggest using simple practice for supervisee documentation? I can't see why not, right? You're paying for the service. I think that you could create the supervisee as a client in there because they are technically your person that you're serving, and keep all of your documentation right there in simple practice. It's HIPAA compliant, and I really can't think of a reason why you wouldn't use that wonderful software that you have available to you. I love these questions. Thank you. Yes, thank you. All right. So business associate agreement, super important for whatever platform you are using to provide your telemental health counseling services or your distance supervision services. We kind of talked about self-service. Again, use a password protected router. If you happen to be on a network that is not closed, you can employ a VPN, but you have to pay for a VPN, and you would buy it from your internet provider. So like access to this VPN, and what it does is it scrambles your wireless connection. So so you certainly can go VPN route, but if at all possible, just stay on a password protected wireless network, right? So a VPN would be like, I have to offer this service from a hotel. But again, you should be in your state of licensure when you offer your services. And that in itself really bumps up against, I think, one of the things that people love most about telemental health counseling is the portability of it, right? So my client's going on a 3-week vacation to Texas, and it's great because we don't have to stop seeing each other, right? And I'm not saying that that's not true. I feel like that is one of the huge benefits to technology, and we should use it to best serve our clients, right? And we want our clients to live their lives. We also want our clients to have their counseling services available, but we have to be very careful with that, because again, if they're on vacation, are they on a wireless network that is not secure? And also, are we licensed to practice in that state? So I think that that's another, COVID has been a really awful and painful experience, and it still continues to be. But that is one of the good things that came out of it, is I think state licensure boards, they're all looking at this, right? So I've got somebody who had to go move back home with mom. Does that mean that I have to immediately terminate services because it's one state over? And I've got, students who are, or clients who are going on vacation, and that's when I use the telemental health counseling the most, or maybe that's the only time I do distance counseling, is when my client goes on vacation. But how do I get maybe temporary exceptions? And a lot of boards are looking into offering temporary services. If you're licensed in another state and your client is a resident of that state where you're licensed and they're in our state temporarily, you can have up to 3 services with them, or, things of that nature. So I do think state boards are starting to write that type of language in, but you can see how that's a slippery slope, right? If I say 3 sessions, well, I do 3 sessions over the period of a year. Like, well, that's too long, probably. So I think it's opened up not only an opportunity, but also a challenge in this way. And we just have to do our best to be diligent of looking up our state's laws and rules and going on a case-by-case basis. All right, business associate agreement, just going to stress that a lot. I've already kind of gone over these things, but texting in general is not HIPAA compliant. You can purchase apps that tout HIPAA compliant text messaging. You can send messages through Simple Practice. I definitely suggest sticking with encrypted email, because also I just feel like texting kind of blurs boundaries anyway. So I just don't necessarily see the need for texting. But I know a lot of clinicians really prefer texting. With our students, I think our students, we really want to limit their texting because they're not ready to really discern appropriate boundaries. And so I tell my students that they're not ever allowed texting their clients. And if a client texts, I will call you back within 8 business hours. And I also have them keep away messages on their email that say, I will get back to you within 8 business hours, to kind of uphold that accessibility piece as well. All right, we talked about storage. Got some guidelines for computerized records, right? Just keeping them password protected and that sort of thing. For payment, you do need to look at an encrypted virtual platform that provides a business associate agreement. And I use Square. So the little square that comes and like plugs into your phone, that is not HIPAA compliant. You can pay $50 for a HIPAA compliant square that plugs into your phone and you actually swipe the card. However, the virtual square, so you get the free swiper and you just don't use it, the virtual platform where you can just email a receipt, an invoice, that is HIPAA compliant, or you can always use paper checks. All right. So one final thing in my final minute is that here's the list of what ACA requires you to include in your informed consent if you are providing telemental health counseling services. And then here's a list of what MBCC requires. And don't worry, I'm going to give you this helpful link here. So I've got an example informed consent. I've got an example emergency response plan that is available at our regional telecounseling development initiative website. And so you can take that, make it your own, feel free to use any of these resources. And I will make sure that I get this PowerPoint to you as well. All right. I've really enjoyed my time, and I see that I've got a lot more stuff to go through, but I certainly will provide you with this information. And I do feel like I got to share the most important and relevant parts of what I wanted to share today. So thank you so very much for attending and for having me.
Thank you so much, Dr. Stargell. This is just such a pleasure. Appreciate you sharing your expertise and kicking off our webinar series. I personally am leaving very informed and inspired from this. Just a reminder to attendees, if you are hoping to get CE credit for this, keep an eye on your email. You'll get a link with a survey, and we will ask in that survey as well for you to not only give feedback about this presentation, but recommend topics for a future webinar series. We do have our webinar series for this year laid out, and I will go ahead and plug that link one more time in the chat. But if you have ideas for presentations you'd like to see in the next couple of years, please send them our ways. And again, thank you so much, Dr. Stargell. Really appreciate your time here.
My pleasure. Thanks to you too. Have a good weekend, everybody.
Take care.